Welcome to Session 2 of the series, An Introduction to the Divine Principle. In this session, we will study the Principle of Creation, Part 1. In the previous segment, the introduction to this series, we talked about 4 points. 1. The ideal of creation. 2. The principles that must be understood in order to achieve the ideal. 3. The fall, or why it is that we are so far from the ideal. And finally, 4, the path that will lead us to the ideal. If we want to understand the ideal, a good place to start is to ask the question, where did this ideal come from? To answer this question, we need to ask what or who designed the universe. In other words, we need to know who the Creator is. Who is God? It used to be thought by some that the universe always existed. The universe just was, and therefore we didn't need a God, a creator, or designer. But now, based on the evidence, most scientists believe that the universe, time and space have a beginning. It's called the Big Bang. This means that which just was, that which is absolute and has no beginning, is not the universe, but something that existed before the universe began, before there was time and space. We, by definition, call this the original being. People of faith call the original being God. It is God, the original being, who caused our universe to be the way it is, to develop as it has towards an ideal, and produce human beings like you and me that are passionate about realizing an ideal in our lives. If we define God as the original being, the question becomes, what is the nature of God? By discovering the nature of God, we will be able to understand why there is an ideal and what that ideal is. But how can we know the nature of something that exists beyond the universe, beyond time and space? The answer is fairly simple. In the book of Romans 1:20, St. Paul explained that the invisible nature of God can be clearly perceived in all the things that have been created. In other words, if everything came from God, then we should be able to find God's invisible nature expressed visibly throughout the universe. Getting to know God through the creation is like getting to know the internal character of an artist by examining their works of art. However, when we look at the universe, at first glance it is difficult to see God's character. There is so much variety. Everything is so unique. But if we look carefully, we will also find qualities that are universal, that everything has. For example, one thing that is universal is that everything has an external form, a body that is made of energy. Particles, molecules, the earth, plants, animals, people, everything, including you and me, has a body, an external form made of energy. And within every being, within its external form, there is always an invisible element. We call this the internal nature. We can't see it, but the internal nature of something is what guides it to act and move in a particular way. The particles that make up atoms and molecules all move in a particular fashion. Their movement is guided by an invisible internal nature, what we commonly call the laws of nature. An apple dropping from a tree, or the movement of the planets around the sun. All of these movements are guided by the invisible laws of nature. Plants have living cells that are guided by invisible forces, and animals have an animal mind with instincts that guide them. And of course, you and me, we each have an invisible mind that guides the way we act. In conclusion, everything has an internal nature and an external form. What does that tell us? It tells us that God, the original being, must possess an original external form, and that God must be the source of all the energy of the universe. On the other hand, it also tells us that God must possess an original internal nature, the source of all the guiding internal natures of the universe. In other words, God possesses the original internal nature and the original external form. Let's take this a step further. If we look at the internal nature of a person, if we look at the human mind, we discover a sense of identity expressed through our intellect, emotion, and will. This would indicate that the original being, God, possesses the original sense of identity, the original intellect, emotion, and will. And if we look even deeper into the human mind, we discover something that is hard to define, something that we call heart. Heart is that part of us that has an irrepressible desire to seek for love, and through that love, to experience the greatest possible joy and fulfillment. This quality of heart did not originate with us. Its origin is in God. This means that God is actually a personal being, a being motivated by heart. This explains why some people, like Jesus and the prophets and the saints, have actually been able to communicate with God. Let's take another look at the universe. There is another characteristic that is universally present in all things. Everything exists with masculine and feminine qualities. Particles and molecules have positive and negative charges. A flower has male and female parts. Animals are male and female, and people exist as men and women. This would indicate that the original being also possesses both masculine and feminine traits. God is our Heavenly Father, and God is also our Heavenly Mother. As it states in Genesis 1:27, the image of God is male and female. How then can we describe God, the original being which existed before time and space began? On one hand, God is a being of external form, the source of all the energy that created the universe. On the other hand, God is also a being of internal nature, or mind. God is a personal being, with a heart from which came the motivation to create the universe. From this perspective, we can conclude that not only can we learn about God through God's creation, but we can also learn about God from God. With our thoughts, we have the potential to sense what God is thinking. With our emotions, we have the potential to sense what God is feeling. With our will, we can sense the will of God. And with our heart, we can experience God's love. This is why, long before we had science, there were people who through prayer and meditation knew about God's heart and His will. This is why it is a good idea to pray. As you study this material, please make time for prayer and reflection. Finally, the greatest truth is that God, the original being, is a God of love. God is the heavenly parent who initiated the work of creation in order to be able to experience the joy of loving. This is the most important truth, and it is the truth that will help us understand the ideal that God intended to realize through the work of creation. Thank you for your participation. In the next session, we are going to look at a model that will help us understand God's creation and how God's ideal is to come into being.